Yes, what is the Anthropocene? There isn't one answer to that, because the Anthropocene is a product of a number of different discourses. But the answer I'm going to give is just going to initially be just kind of a general one. The Anthropocene is, at that general level, taken to be the displacement of the significance of the Holocene, which is the way in which our geological moment of time has been designated. So the suggestion is that the Anthropocene displaces that, and there's a kind of an ambiguity there, because it displaces that with a claim of being the next geological moment, but it isn't a geological category. And that kind of opens it up to its claim of ownership by other discourses. So the Anthropocene, from one perspective, and from the kind of geological scientific perspective, is put in that discourse. But the Anthropocene and its emphasis on the anthropos, puts it into the humanities. So at that point you've got a contest of ownership between science and culture. Like quite a few concepts, it's one which is in general circulation, but there isn't a common understanding, there isn't a common meaning. And in all contexts, what is absent is a kind of a critical perspective on what it actually means. So there's some confusion about meaning, and there's some confusion about appropriateness, and what isn't arriving is what is the other of the Anthropocene in the context of the state of the world. Well, again, there is not a consensual view of that. Climate change would be seen to be one of the contributing factors in the creation of the Anthropocene causally, on the basis that the Anthropocene is a manifestation of human impacts kind of destabilizing natural processes and creating a dystopic condition in relation to human futures and other species. Now, climate change, can be seen to be elemental to that, but the Anthropocene is not a product of just the causal factors from climate change. So that kind of begs the question of what other human activities have taken place that kind of negate our future. And that takes you to a very different way of understanding the very cause of the Anthropocene. So the climate change perspective on the Anthropocene links back to the claim that it began with the Industrial Revolution and the acceleration of emissions that caused climate change. A more fundamental way of understanding it is that it was actually intrinsic to the very nature of our action, or the action of hominoids on the natural environment, on the planet. And that action actually prefigured our existence as a species. As soon as humanoids started to use tools, they started to change the world. That process of world transformation is what ends up with the claim of the Anthropocene. So, one can progress then from, the first stone tools to the first industrial processes to the Industrial Revolution, and then the acceleration of industrial production post the Industrial Revolution. So I see it in those terms as an incredibly long lineage rather than a causal moment. From a kind of a perspective of disciplines, that would appear to be the case. And from a perspective of kind of environmental politics, that would appear to be the case. But, what's absent from that kind of binary characterization, where people who, for example, would defend geological understandings of the planet, who might remain attached to the concept of the Holocene, would want to be in opposition. Others from both environmental and humanist perspectives would want to defend the Anthropocene as an appropriate way of understanding the contemporary moment. But what's absent is a critical perspective on the Anthropocene as a Eurocentric, anthropocentric construction. So, at the moment, there is not a corresponding critical public perspective that's going along with the actual promotional projection of the Anthropocene as an appropriate way of defining our moment in time. And the other dimension, that's important to recognise, is that it gets posed as a universal, but it isn't something which is universally comprehended. So, in a sense, the Anthropocene is a concept that's only shared by quite a small percentage of the global population. So that kind of reinforces, again, a really kind of needed critical perspective, which is at the moment lacking. Well, you can't actually divide the two, because the source of the Anthropocene epistemologically comes from the problem of anthropocentrism, or the centrality of anthropos. So it comes out of a kind of a humanistic, humanitas understanding of our being, which comes back to the notion of its universalism. So just as anthropocentrism imposed a notion of the centrality of human interest over all other interest, so the Anthropocene kind of translates that into a form of global domination that kind of links back to the anthropocentricity that comes out of anthropocentrism, and that all centres around the privilege given to anthropos. So anthropos, is the humanist definition of the human as universal, and that kind of brings it really to the question of cosmology, because that very notion is a imposition, a prefiguration of the human as the sole mode of being of our species. Well, we can't, if we take ourselves to be human, we can't escape it. But the notion of the human is a notion that entirely depends upon the cosmology in which the human is constituted. but that cosmology is not universal. So the return question would be, if you take indigenous people who have been incredibly damaged, but who come from cosmologies that defined what they were in other ways than the human, were they anthropocentric? Well, they couldn't be. They might have a centrism in relation to their own cosmology, but it was not the same cosmology. And it didn't presume the division between the animal and the human as a cultural construct which is indivisible from the meaning of anthropocentrism. So if a cosmology kind of works on the principle that we are simply another animal amongst animals, that then undercuts the possibility of that designation of being, that cosmology, being able to be claimed as anthropocentric. Now, one of the things which is happening at the moment is an appeal to indigenous cultures as modes of being that actually can counter the ways of life that are implied in the Anthropocene. Well, I think Claire Colebrook is a way into that that needs to be connected to the claim of the current moment being a crisis that is marked by the claim of the beginning of the sixth extinction event. So what do we learn by kind of reflecting upon the other five extinction events? Because each one of those events kind of designates a particular kind of moment of the temporality of being on this planet, or beings on this planet. And in each case, an extinction has arrived as a result of some change in climatic conditions. So, in a sense, the moment of the Anthropocene, forgetting about the term, but recognizing the circumstances, is a continuation of the terminal nature of any kind of climatic moment in the existence of the planet. And you can think about that in terms of the future as much as the past. So that's the destiny of this planet, in its condition, like any other planet, of climatic instability or geological instability. Planets only have a limited amount of life. The nature of the system that we're in, the solar system, is designated by the life of the sun. So what we don't know are how many conditions of transformation of life are going to occur between the moment which is now called the crisis in relation to the Anthropocene and the eventual solar catastrophe of the extinguishing of life on this planet and the planet itself. So it's important to kind of recognize the period of hominid planetary existence as existing within the limits of a condition of climate stability, which is not going to continue, which was not in existence in the past and will not be in existence in the future. So we are a fated species, but all other species are equally fated.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's a failure to recognise the place of design and human action in causing a problem. And you can't solve a problem with the source that creates it. Okay, so that immediately kind of brings into question the use of design as it's currently understood, or architecture as it's currently understood, as a way of addressing the problem. The other thing that kind of goes along with that is a kind of naivety of designers and architects, which goes back, again to the same point of not spending a sufficient amount of time really understanding what the problem is. There's always this tendency to immediately go to a received problem as if it were the problem, and then try to start solving it with design interventions, which are almost always and almost certainly completely gestural and token. The agency of what they do is minuscule. So the implication of what I'm saying is, if you are truly concerned, if you are really committed to trying to increase the ability, the agency, to intervene in some way that is going to have some significant effect, the place to begin is to reconceptualize and reconstitute a practice that is able to actually actively intervene. Now, design is, as it is structurally incapable of doing that, because it's a service industry. It's an industry that is, causing or industry itself, even in its reform forms, is causing the problems which are trying to be overcome by design. So the imperative is a recreation of design. And that isn't just a recreation of a practice, but that's an epistemological challenge of how do you start to create a knowledge of design that enables design to be constituted as a practice that's independent from its condition of limitation and actually has really significant power in the world. And the beginning of that is recognizing the difference between the way in which design is impacted on the world and the limitation of the way in which designers understand design as agency. We live in a completely designed world in terms of our perceptions, our actions, our environment, and our materiality. And that is not in any way reflected in the professional practice of design or the nature of design education. Or to put it really very simply, design as we understand it is small design, and the reality that we exist is in big design. One is, the question of temporality was brought up, but in terms of thinking about action, what kind of, I think people assume is that you can do something quickly. The action is something that you make a decision about and you start doing. Whereas the things that I've talked about, no matter how urgent they are, take an extraordinarily long time to actually be able to do. If I'm saying we've got to kind of reconstitute the nature of how you think about design, understand it, and then practice it, that isn't something that you can do it in a month or a year or a decade. That's a kind of an intergenerational project. And that links to how we understand the problem. Because if you take, for example, climate change, the assumption is that there's a problem of emissions, And if we can get the emissions down to pre-industrial levels, then we've solved the problem. But we haven't, because the processes of climate change take an extraordinarily long time to correct. You know, to take one example, you know, the planetary climate is controlled by deep ocean temperatures. The ocean is effectively the thermostat of the planet. And those deep ocean temperatures take around about 200 years to change. Equally, that means that, you know, what's happening with the melting of ice in the Antarctic and the Arctic is going to go on no matter what we do about emissions. That's going to continue. So we've got sea level rises no matter what we do in relation to emissions. So there's a kind of a way in which people are just incapable of thinking in time, and they're certainly incapable at the moment of designing in time. And, you know, there is almost no public discussion about the actual nature of the problem. And the same applies to the indivisible relation between unsustainability and the Anthropocene. You know, one of the most obvious things that should be linked and explained is unsustainability as that which needs to be unpacked and understood in order to understand what is claimed to be the Anthropocene. But the Anthropocene is given a kind of a standalone kind of status as a problem. So when initially, you know, the question of the Anthropocene was raised, and the kind of the disciplinary claims to it, you know, that's one dimension of ownership. But there are other insignificant ways in which it is being claimed. So it becomes claimed by a kind of the environmental movement to kind of reinvigorate their discourse and to try to kind of generate more public interest or awareness or support. But equally, it's claimed by the cultural domain, it's claimed by avant-gardists, it's claimed by writers as just another topic to get into, to explore another dimension of the dystopic existence of human beings on this planet at this time. So there is a kind of a way in which every ownership, you know, casts its own definition for its own purposes. And equally that would apply to anthropology. So what is absent is a kind of a meta-discourse of the Anthropocene. What is absent is a kind of a critical agenda in relation to the Anthropocene. It actually almost kind of falls into kind of momentary, fashionable preoccupations. So what would happen if we had a really kind of critical culture is that a redefinition of our moment that would be more appropriate would come out of a critique of the Anthropocene. But it seems that it's impossible under our current circumstances to get to that moment. And the kind of question of resistance is, you know, hugely rejected or neglected. So we exist in conditions where it isn't simply that the idea of the Anthropocene is resisted, but the whole idea of critical inquiry of our moment is being resisted because of the investment in the status quo. So then that completely folds back into this kind of inability to think in time. So industry, government, the whole political sphere do not have the ability to think in time. So if there is a concern about acting in time, if there is a concern of accepting the Anthropocene as a problem which demands action, like design would like to act, again, a starting point is to confront the question of temporality, the question of being in time now, and that relation to kind of future action. Well, the question of knowledge and the Anthropocene really goes in two directions. One direction that we've already touched on is the condition of limitation of disciplines. So we take disciplines as the kind of pathway to the acquisition of new knowledge, but their division of knowledge, their specialisms, their fragmentation, means that they cannot get near actually kind of recognizing and engaging the relational complexity of the situation that now pertains as the problem of the future of our existence. Now that kind of folds into the whole issue of education, of university education, and what currently constitutes the curricula and what actually should constitute the curriculum. So if universities were about creating the knowledge which is appropriate to the world we now live in and its future, it would require to kind of privilege the kind of areas of critical inquiry that I talked about. So the Anthropocene or unsustainability would be implicated in everything that is being taught in every area of exploration in the university. It isn't something that would be owned by any particular discipline. It would be a way of actually integrating disciplinary inquiry, of focusing disciplinary inquiry. Or to put it in very simple terms, the question would be, what does your area of knowledge able to contribute to the future of our being? And how does that demand mean that you reconstitute the very notion of what it is that you know and do? So all that I'm saying really is what I said about design, needing to kind of recreate itself to be able to have some efficacy in the face of the problems that are being posed that need to be solved. That principle applies to every area of knowledge and every discipline currently in the academy.